Hello, everyone. I'm Lance Belbro, and I'd like to present Jimmy Carter, the cause of radical Islam today. So, we're going to be talking about the situations that happened with Watergate, with everyone involved, and eventually even the oil embargo. All of these things were involved in how we have radical Islam today. But today, we're going to be starting in the 1976 election, where Jimmy Carter was elected over Gerald Ford Carter and selected by the Democrats because he was a Washington outsider. So now let's go into 1979, the secret agreement. So on 27th January 1979, Ayatollah al-Ruhollah al-Khomeini, founder of Iran's Islamic Republic, the man who called the United States the Great Satan, sent a secret message to Washington. So here it is. From his home in exile outside Paris, the defiant leader of the Iranian Revolution effectively offered the Carter administration a deal. Iranian military leaders listen to you, he said, but the Iranian people follow my orders. So if President Jimmy Carter could use his influence on the military to clear the way for his takeover, Khomeini suggested, he would calm the nation. Stability could be restored, and America's interests and citizens in Iran would be protected. So an American president just sold out an ally. Because when Carter entered the political fray in 1976, America was still riding the liberal wave of anti-Vietnam War motion. Carter was persuaded that the Shah was not fit to rule Iran. In his anti-war pacifism, Carter never got it that Khomeini, a cleric exiled to Iraq, was preparing Iran for his revolution. His weapon of choice was not the sword, but the media. Using tape cassettes smuggled by Iranian pilgrims returning from the holy city of Najaf, he fueled disdain for what he called Garb City. So foreshadowing of a change. Jimmy Carter's presidency was a cascade of national security catastrophes precipitated by saying too much at the wrong time. On New Year's Eve, going into 1978, he toasted the Shah of Iran at a state dinner in Tehran as an island of stability. By August, the president was demanding immediate, free and fair elections in Iran. So here is a picture from New Year's Eve of that very moment. And here is his words to the Shah in December 31. Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. This is a great tribute to you, your majesty, and to your leadership, and to the respect and the admiration and love which your people give to you. So when Carter had your back, you better watch out. Carter considered the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as an ally or friend. In December 1977, he visited Tehran and toasted the Shah for making Iran an island of stability and for the admiration and love which your people give you. It was a delusional toast, one that demonstrated a total lack of understanding of historical legacies and the political fires raging in Iran. He quickly changed his mind because a year later, he changed his mind and government in Iran. On January 16, 1979, the Shah fled to Egypt, and 2 weeks later, Carter's ambassador in Tehran described Ayatollah as a Gandhi-like figure. Days later, after the Ayatollah was declared supreme ruler, a Carter administration spokesman described the holy man to be a person of impeccable integrity. So Carter and other deep state people believe this. If anybody ruined Iran, it was President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Together and with the help of the CIA, they instigated the coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh and the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran and installed the Shah as an absolute monarch. They did this in 1953 to prevent Mossadegh from nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian oil company, now called BP, and preserving more of the value of Iran's oil for the Iranian people. So there is a slight problem with this idea. It isn't true at all, because Ayatollah was far from a Gandhi-like figure. In November 1963, he sent a message to the United States government through his Haj Mirza Khalid Kamari, a professor of the theological faculty of the Tehran University and an Iranian politician close to oppositionist religious groups. So essentially, he explained that he was not opposed to American interests in Iran at all. On the contrary, he thought the American presence was necessary as a counterbalance to Soviet and possibly British influence. He also explained his belief in close cooperation between Islam and other world religions, particularly Christendom. So he preyed on President Carter for this. This is his cable to Carter. So Carter administration key players in 1979. One of them was William Sullivan, the U.S. ambassador to Iran. Another one was Cyrus Vance, the U.S. Secretary of State, and Warren Zimmerman, a political counselor with the U.S. Embassy in France, used as a messenger for the U.S. to Khomeini. Robert E. Husser, too, as a U.S. Air Force general sent by Carter on a secretive mission to Tehran in January 1979. So here is President Carter's action on that same month. The president's man in Tehran was feeling the pressure and needed reassurance. On January 12, 1979, General Robert Dutch Husser wrote to Harold Brown, U.S. Secretary of Defense, and General David Jones, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to make sure he knew what they wanted him to do. In my conversation with Secretary Brown the night of January 11, 1979, there seemed to be some doubt in your mind as to my understanding of U.S. policy and my instructions, Husser wrote in a cable. I believe I thoroughly understood, and I am following them to the letter. Husser then outlined point by point his terms of reference as he understood them. The last U.S. ambassador to Iran, William Sullivan, had plans of his own. He secretly met with the representatives of Ayatollah Khomeini before the revolution, and President Jimmy Carter and wife Rosalind escort Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi of Iran and the Shah Banu to a state dinner to the White House in 1977. So Carter sends General Husser to talk to Iran's military. 6 things Carter sent General Husser to tell Iran is this. First, it was vital for the U.S. and Iran to have a strong and stable government ties. Second, Carter was deeply impressed with the Imperial Iranian Armed Forces. Third, the president believed that the best interests of all can be realized by a strong and stable civilian government. Fourth, Bakhtiar's new civilian government must have the full support of the military. And fifth, this support can only be achieved if military leaders stick to their jobs. They should not leave the country, and they should work as one team. Finally, sixth, the U.S. government from the president on down remain strongly behind them. But Husser knew Carter and his advisors had not ruled out U.S. support for a coup. Within the cabinet, there had been a split between Brzezinski, the national security advisor, who supported immediate action, and Vance, the Secretary of State, who opposed a coup at all costs. So Carter split the difference in opposing a coup unless certain conditions were met. Brzezinski wanted his order to convey to the Iranian military a green light to stage a military coup. Husser wrote in his memoir and considered that it did so. President Carter intended it to convey such a meaning only as a last resort. In his cable, Husser explained to Brown and Jones that he had already reiterated to the generals that the U.S. support for a future coup was contingent on their prior support for Bakhtiar. And I have told them that I have considered a military coup as an absolutely last resort. I have explained to them that there are degrees before that action. So support for coup depended on these 3 conditions. First, Bakhtiar had to be given a chance to exert his authority. Second, if the internal situation worsened, he might declare martial law and call out the army to restore basic services like running the oil fields or maintaining the power grid. And finally, third, only if steps 1 and 2 failed would the U.S. endorse a military takeover. Towards the end of his cable, Husser summed up his instructions this way: I'll do my best to give full support to Bakhtiar and not jump into a military coup. So his mission was doomed, not least because the White House had failed to inform the Shah that an American general had been dispatched to provide unsolicited advice to Iran's senior command. This astonishing breach of protocol enraged Zahedi, in Iran's ambassador to the U.S., who told him in 2012 that he urged the Shah to have Husser arrested and deported. So the Shah had good reason to be alarmed. He knew U.S. Ambassador William Sullivan had made discreet contact with Khomeini's representatives in Tehran and was involved in negotiations for the Ayatollah's return from exile. Sullivan's failure to consult the White House before taking this drastic step led to the confusion among the Iranians over U.S. goals in the first place. The Shah had this not as evidence of incompetence, but as proof of an American conspiracy to depose him. His senior officers wanted to put an end to the American games right away. So the generals came to him and offered to shoot Husser, Zahedi told me. The fear was that the Americans were about to repeat their involvement in the 1967 coup in Greece against King Constantine. So Carter's foreign policy changes. In a key meeting at the White House Situation Room on January 11, 1979, the CIA predicted that Khomeini would sit back and let his moderate Western educated followers and his second in command, Ayatollah Mohammad Bashir, run the government. Bashir was considered by the US officials to be a rare bird, a pragmatic, English-speaking cleric with a university education, the experience of living in the West, and close ties to Khomeini. In short, he was someone with whom the Americans could reason. So the failed Carter policy is this. The Carter administration began secret talks with Khomeini with the primary objective of making an elusive deal between the Ayatollah and the military. Khomeini, however, wanted a decisive victory, not a deal. But a tactical engagement with Washington suited him well. So Khomeini, in fact, had a set of key questions to determine Carter's commitment to the Shah's regime and the orientation of the Iranian military. The Ayatollah didn't have to try very hard. America would easily reveal its hand, and he received a clear signal that the US considered the Shah finished, and in fact was looking for a face-saving way to protect the military and avoid a communist takeover. So what Carter wanted is that his administration wanted to know about the future of the US core interests in Iran, American investments, oil flow, political military relations, and the view on the Soviet Union. Khomeini answered the questions in writing the next day with an artfully crafted portrait of an Islamic republic, free of Soviet domination, neutral, if not friendly to America, one that would not export revolution or cut oil flow to the West. Khomeini also vowed not to destabilize the region, not interference in other people's affairs, he wrote. So this is what he wanted. Carter's gamut proved to be a massive blunder, and the real danger was overlooked. Khomeini's ambitions were underestimated and his moves were misread. Less than a year later, he, while holding the US chargé d'affaires and dozens of other Americans during the Iranian hostage crisis, declared that America can't do a damn thing. He then celebrated the first anniversary of his victory with a major proclamation. Iran was going to fight American imperialism worldwide. So this is the reconstruction of history, the lies that are told. The Shah was forcing Western culture on Iran. This is a total lie. The Shah brought more freedom to Iran and rolled back the policies of his father, who had actually tried to force Iran to westernize or modernize. It was his father who actually passed laws forcing men to wear bowler hats and forbidding women to wear the veil. The last Shah, his son, did away with that and gave people the freedom to adopt Western styles if they wanted to. A woman didn't have to wear a veil, but she could if she wanted to. He also enacted real freedom of religion in Iran, which oddly enough I have even heard some people criticize him for. But remember that the current regime claims to have freedom of religion as well. It is only that everyone knows this is another lie and no one takes it seriously at all. It should also be recommended that many of the cultural aspects people, especially Westerners, associate with Iran is actually not part of Iranian culture at all. Much of it is not really Iranian or Islamic, but it is simply Arab and dates back to the Arab conquest of the old Sassanid Empire. So here's the second lie. The Shah was a puppet of the US. This is a common belief that's not true at all. Probably the most widely believed and oft-touted of the lies revolutionaries tell, mostly because it gains traction and the more popular the US becomes, it is nonetheless untrue. I have long found it very amusing that people who hate America have so much in common with those who worship America. One thinks America does nothing good and the other that America does nothing bad. But both believe that America is the center of the world and all life revolves around Washington, D.C. It is utter nonsense. First of all, this accusation tends to come from the episode in which the Shah was briefly overthrown but was restored to the throne with the assistance of the British and the American intelligence agencies. The untold truth here is that the British always had far more interest in Iran than the Americans did in the first place. The British had interest in Iran going back a very long time. They had established most of the oil industry in that place, and it was the British, not the Americans, who were the driving force behind the restoration of the Shah. It is only when British power began to decline and American power rising up that the US became the great bogeyman. It was when Russia and England invaded Iran in 1941, that they kicked out his father, the Shah, allowed the new Shah, a 21-year-old son of the Shah, to take over. Russia and England were worried about the Nazis taking over the Persian oil fields, and then in 1953, when a coup was started to replace the Shah, the CIA stepped in and helped him back to obtain his throne. This was an effort by the West to keep Iran from going communist at all costs. Now let's go on to the third lie. The Ayatollah stood up to the evil Americans. Like the previous one, the mullahs in Iran have gotten a great deal of mileage out of this lie, particularly as America becomes more unpopular. The Ayatollah Khomeini is portrayed as the courageous man of the principle who stood up to the big bad American wolf. In fact, the Ayatollah was a liar from the start to finish, who lied to everyone, and we now know from recently declassified documents that he actively courted the support of the United States and tried his best to tell American leaders everything they wanted to hear. We also now know that despite the lies the Carter administration has been telling for years, that they made a conscious decision to abandon the Shah and did not think the Ayatollah would be so bad, which shows how incompetent Carter and the crew were, if any more evidence were needed on that front. Now, the fourth lie was the Islamic Revolution was a counter-revolution. This is possibly the most absurd, but I have heard it repeated too often, invariably by people on the far right, not to point it out. This is the lie that claims that the Shah was some sort of radical progressive and that the Islamic Revolution brought things back to normal, made Iran a more traditional and conservative country than had previously been the case. It is hard to even think about it without laughing. This may be a good example of a big lie being more readily believed than a small one, because this is a very big lie. The Ayatollah and his crew were revolutionaries, plain and simple, in both political and religious spheres alike. So Sullivan's right to attempt to get the U.S. to consider removing support from the Shah in 1978 soured his relationship with Carter. So the U.S. ambassador argued against the Shah on November 9th, 1978, in the now famous cable, Thinking the Unthinkable. The U.S. ambassador to Iran, William Sullivan, warned that the Shah was doomed. He argued that Washington should get the Shah and his top generals out of Iran and then make a new deal between junior commanders and Khomeini. The White House changes on this date. On January 9, 1979, the Deputy National Security Advisor David Aaron wrote this to his boss, Brzezinski, Carter's National Security Advisor. The best that can result, in my view, is a military coup against Bakhtiar and then a deal struck between the military and Khomeini that finally pushes the Shah out of power. Just 2 days later, President Carter pressed the Shah to leave promptly. That is worse than just giving him little or no support. The U.S. actively pushed for him to flee his country in order to create a power vacancy there. So, on that same month of 1979, the summit at Guadalupe. In an interview with President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the former president of France during the time of America's first crisis with Iran, I was told that in 1979 he met with Carter in Guadalupe for a summit, as he did Helmut Schmidt of Germany and James Callaghan of Great Britain. Carter told this group of men that the U.S. was going to support Khomeini instead of the Shah of Iran. In essence, Mr. d'Estaing said he realized that the U.S. was trading its strongest pro-Western Persian Gulf ally in favor of a terrorist Muslim cleric. I was horrified, said d'Estaing. The only way I can describe Jimmy Carter is that he was a bastard of conscience. This is him selling out the Shah on that month. So to topple the Shah, the policy began in Nixon administration. So Hugh Chang, one of the Shah's minister and closest advisors, reveals in his book, The Last Shah of Iran, we now know that the idea of deposing the Shah was approached continually from the mid-70s on in the National Security Council in Washington by Henry Kissinger, whom the Shah thought of as a firm friend. This is him and Henry Kissinger, as you can see. So now Iran benefited from the surge in oil prices. Mohammad Reza Shah's rule of Iran from 42 to 79 spanned 8 U.S. presidents. His desire for military supremacy over his neighbors and his distrust of Soviets led him to seek a military relationship with the United States following the end of the Second World War. As the U.S.-Iranian relationship developed, the idea of arming Iran came to form a key component of the U.S. policy due to waning U.S. options in the Gulf through the 1960s and alignment in US and Iranian regional policies in the early 1970s. This relationship eventually resulted in Iran wielding a military that was on paper within reach of becoming the world's fifth most advanced force in 1978. So this is Iran's blank check defense spending. By the time of Richard Nixon's arrival in office in 1969 January, Iran was already America's single largest arms purchaser. Whilst this is notable in and of itself, it is vastly overshadowed by what followed. By late 1972, Nixon leveraged U.S. Middle Eastern regional policy primarily around the focal point of a military-strong pro-American Iran. Concurrently, the Shah was encouraged and empowered to begin an unprecedented and virtually unmoderated military spending spree in what is now known as the blank check. So let's go into the Nixon Doctrine. The Cold War was at an interesting point when Nixon came into the office in the late 60s. On July 25, 1969, the president outlined his Detente-style foreign policy through a speech later called the Nixon Doctrine. On that July day, Nixon stated that the U.S. troops would withdraw from Asia, where we had previously been fighting to prevent the spread of communism. So why the change? Were we abandoning the fight against communism? Not at all. For Nixon, this was a strategic retreat. Rather than risk creating another Vietnam War, the withdrawal of American troops would allow Asian nations to take responsibility for their own defense. So Nixon Doctrine represented a pretty big change in American foreign policy. Rather than try to fight communism all around the world, Nixon asserted that each nation needed to do its own part to fight communism. Nixon on the world's stage. So why did he do this in the first place? Well, he did this for two reasons. Firstly, the British decided to withdraw their military forces from the Gulf, leaving behind a vacuum of sorts. Secondly, the Vietnam quagmire stressed the limits of the direct application of the U.S. power in peripheral areas. Iran seemed the obvious candidate to turn to, and there was a legacy of the U.S. investment going back to the 1953 coup that the CIA engineered with the British to restore the Shah's autocracy after a left-leaning nationalist government had marginalized him. Other possible pro-U.S. candidates were eliminated from consideration, in which Saudi Arabia had languished in military redundancy, beset by political instability, and moving any closer to Israel would risk pushing the Arab states further toward the Soviets. So this is essentially what the doctrine is. In 1969, the doctrine was vital in adopting the peaceful foreign policy rather than the continuation of the unpopular armed intervention. United States adopted a more friendly policy by offering assistance in military defense when requested, and also offered assistance as a shield in case of the use of nuclear power and the threats to the freedom of allies. This was essential in the development of a friendly relationship between the United States and Latin America. So this Nixon Doctrine in Iran, because with Britain's imminent departure from the Persian Gulf region, Nixon built up Shah as a regional proxy there. So this is his foreign policy as we see it now. The secret plan was Vietnamization. The Detente was easing of tensions. The goal was to isolate Vietnam and exploit the differences between the USSR and China. Nixon Doctrine, well, its U.S. allies should no longer expect U.S. to send troops to support them, and the SALT Treaty was arms limits, and the War Powers Act was pressed 90 days for approval. So the Shah begins to pick up the pace. Within the space of a few short months in 1972, the Shah purchased over $3 billion of arms from the United States, a 20-fold increase on the prior year. For the remainder of the 1970s, the Shah continued to buy arms in the multi-billions per annum, dwarfing all other U.S. allies such as Israel and the NATO nations. In this Shah, Washington had an ally who was willing to accept a position as a regional policeman and rich enough to afford to do so due to his ever-rising oil income. In return, Iran secured a high-level alliance with its preferred side in the Cold War, a buffer against potential Soviet incursions from its northern border. It was a win-win scenario for both nations, yet the pros and the arrangement overshadowed a series of significant cons. So under the Nixon Doctrine, Iran began to be a large power. The wisdom of choosing Iran as the primary vehicle for outsourcing containment in the Gulf was controversial in its very essence. Firstly, Iran was not an Arab nation like the majority of its neighbors. Secondly, the Iranian religious population was comprised of Shia Muslims rather than regionally dominant Sunnis. Thirdly, Under the Shah's rule, Iran was widely perceived as an arrogant status quo threatening regime by its neighbors. In sum, the Shah's Iran was neither respected nor liked in the region. Therefore, investing in promoting Iranian hegemony as a proxy for American power was at odds with the reality in the wider region. Additionally, the disproportionate extent of the military investment in the Shah's regime is partially responsible for the tide of anti-American sentiment that endures in Iran to this day. If this Shah had not been overthrown by the Iranians themselves in '79, it is likely that wider regional opposition would have manifested the Shah's ambitions as his plans became ever grander. For those reasons, Nixon's blank check and the policy package that surrounded it was an extremely risky bet. So now let's look at Ford in the driver's seat. So Ford's first Secretary of Defense, Jim Schlesinger, led a small cabal in the administration advising that the relationship with Iran was unwise. Schlesinger's concern was that which had traction in the Pentagon and in other departments such as the USAID and the Treasury, was that Iran could not absorb the arms it was buying due to its primitive level of development. Reports that Iran had regularly import such low-level personnel as truck drivers due to a lack of skills in domestic workforce did not inspire confidence that it could operate its 80 F-14s and other advanced U.S. equipment. In that sense, the arms being sold required the presence of many thousands of U.S. support staff who risked becoming a proxy U.S. military force deployed at the service of a foreign government or liability in the case of a security breakdown in Iran. Concurrently, the vast military budget of the Shah was stunning the Iranian economic progress and could lead to unforeseen social problems. Schlesinger was sacked by Ford and replaced with Donald Rumsfeld, who together with Henry Kissinger ensured that any trends in Washington to upset the path of the U.S.-Iranian arms policy were muted. Nixon resignations changes everything, though. When Nixon was forced to resign to avoid impeachment over the Watergate affair, the successor Gerald R. Ford administration found itself the steward for an Iran arms policy that was under the threat from within the administration and from Congress. Executive power had peaked in the Nixon years in what has been widely referred to as a period of imperial presidency. Yet by 1974, Congress had begun to recover lost ground. Congress continually battled with the Ford for influence over military sales, with Iran at the forefront of the concerns due to its extraordinarily large volume of purchases. The truth was, Congress was in the dark. It and the public by extension had no idea what was going on with the U.S.-Iranian relations at all. Nixon had kept the arrangement secret, as we have stated previously. So this was our fate sealed. While Schlesinger's concerns were legitimate, the security relationship was too important to suffer second-guessing in the short term. Ultimately, Ford's full approval for the military and strategic relationship that Nixon initiated with Iran ensured that the events of the early 70s became the norm rather than an irregularity. It was the act that sealed the fate of the United States in its relationship with the Shah. So Carter's human rights ideal changed the dynamics of everything. Jimmy Carter triumphantly in the presidential election of 1976, partially on a popular platform of increased arms control and the introduction of human rights considerations in U.S. foreign policy. Despite the Shah's authoritarian nature and Iran being a prime example of an extreme arms policy, the post-72 relationship with Iran largely endured. In '77, Carter actually sold more arms to Iran than the United States had during any prior year. Carter did introduce some nuance into the relationship by ending the blank check culture that had characterized the Nixon-Ford for years. Instead of approving all arms requests by default, he sought to moderate the Shah's ambitions. In reality, this had little effect on the overall relationship due to the Shah's power of persuasion and the leverage in which he held it as a pivotal ally in such a region. The Shah continued to prepare arms sales requests in the multi-billions as of late mid-1978, safe in the knowledge that he had backing of the president, who had toasted the Shah as a rock of stability. So arm thy enemy. By maintaining the arms relationship with the Shah, Carter's experience exemplifies the lack of alternatives that existed for the U.S. regional policy by the late 1970s. After the 30 years of investment and political winnowing, America's regional options had become heavily leveraged on the Shah's Iran. A path of dependency had taken hold that even an anti-arms president was powerless to materially alter at all. It had been no surprise that Ford had continued to arm Iran, but witnessing the same advocacy from Carter is testament to the power and influence that Washington had outsourced to the Shah. The project was simply, in today's jargon, too big to fail. Unfortunately, for US policymakers, the Iranian people had other intentions in mind. The removal of the Shah and his regime through the winter of 78-79 tore Iran from the United States, and a deeply hostile regime took over in Tehran. The largest deployment of US arms in one single country fell into the hands of angry mobs shouting, "Death to America and Israel." This is the Carter Doctrine. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States. President Carter warned that such an assault would be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. Carter did this. These are revolutionary images of which he is responsible for. All of these things that happened, he is the one who secretly made the plan, but the people did not like this at all. On February 1, 1979, Khomeini, with the help of others, returns. So this is the Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ruhollah Mosawi Khomeini. And he was a religious and political leader behind the Iranian hostage situation. He had a lot of political power and was a Grand Ayatollah. This is a spiritual reference. He was the man that Iranians looked for to spiritual guidance. Khomeini did not like the West and disliked the ruler of Iran. In fact, he refused to enter Iran until the king left. When the king left in 79, Khomeini wasted no time taking over the government. Khomeini helped create a new constitution for the Islamic Republic of Iran, and he elected himself supreme leader. His followers were the ones that seized the embassy, and Khomeini backed the action and used it as a bargaining chip against the US on many occasions. He even went as far as to say, "America can't do a thing." So once a man came to Imam Khomeini and told him, "You have taken Iran 300 years backwards with the revolution." Imam Khomeini replied to him, "I'm looking to take it back 1400 years to the times of the Rasul Allah and Amir al-Mu'minin." So why did this happen? Well, it happened because of these things. Opposition to the Shah was widespread. Many Shiites wanted the Iran government by Islamic law, and the Islamic clergy became the voice of opposition, and the revolution was governed by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. So on April 1st, 1979, Iran became the first Islamic Republic. So on November 4th, 1979, Iran takes these US hostages because they are in charge now. And this is the hostage crisis that we had, and as you can see from the news heading here, the rescue fails. It was fully my decision. It was Carter's fault, and he just went with it. The hostage rescue fails again, as you can see from multiple newspaper headings. So now I'd like to bring up a quote from the Khomeini himself. "Non-Muslims, Frank, somewhere between faces the sweat of a camel and that has eaten impure food." As you can see from the multiple things, he is the one in charge of that place now. He is the one who made the uprising, and he is the one who is very anti-American. So now let's look into how Reagan becomes president. Shortly after 4 a.m. on Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1981, the administration of then President Jimmy Carter relinquished money to the Iranians. According to one source, the transfer required 14 banks and the participation of 5 nations acting concurrently. After the election of Ronald Reagan in November 1980, Carter became more determined than ever to secure the release of the hostages on his watch. He was successful, but barely, as you can see from the newspaper headings previously. During marathon negotiating sessions in the wee hours of January 20, 1981, the Bank of England was approved as the repository of escrow funds, and shortly after 4 a.m. on Inauguration Day, the Carter administration relinquished money to the Iranians. According to one source, the transfer required 14 banks and the participation of 5 nations acting concurrently. So this is the Iran of today. This was created by the actions of Jimmy Carter, and what we have stems from the very things that happened. The very radical person that was set in charge, Jimmy Carter was the one responsible for. And I'd like to conclude on that, and I hope you viewers appreciate it for the points I brought up.